just to summate some of the stuff that you were talking about, a lot of it comes down to lab capacity, the challenges of lab capacity. That's something that Philomena had mentioned in the Ebola setting. Bonnie, you'd mentioned this in terms of the getting molecular diagnostics into elimination programs, integrating them. Lucas, I know you're dealing with that, and I wanted to ask this question, that your work in terms of the polio network, leaning on that lab, how much of that is will that become a blueprint for the way things are going to be done in the future? How do you feel about that? I mean, it looks excellent. Oh, you'll have to use this. Sorry, I'll have to do it. Yeah.
I think the initial results were promising, but there's a lot of changes to the infrastructure that need to be made that are perhaps less direct. So I think generally doing the science is pretty straightforward. I think some of the biggest challenges we face is in dealing with the different administration systems put in place in these different countries, which varies geographically. Personal relationships can come into play. So I feel I think the science is perhaps sometimes less of the issue. And it's also convincing the wider international community that, okay, you don't have to pack up the Global Polio Laboratory Network Committee network just yet, just because polio has been eradicated. You know, use some kind of incentive to allow further funding to be provided, because there's a potential that there'll be a greater need for funding, because perhaps more samples are coming in, they require more sample processing, and so you need to convince the various stakeholders involved that it's worthwhile doing and it's worth investing. Brilliant. And perhaps breaking down some of the silos between these diseases. Again, and maybe you'll have to talk about what samples are being involved. So we're using fecal samples, but that might not be the most practical sample to use in other cases, and then different transport systems. So the optimist in me says, yeah, this is a good thing to go forward and carry out, but perhaps the reality of the world we live in might present challenges.
Okay, that's an interesting answer. Bonnie, to you, in terms of your input into that, who needs to step up to that challenge? I asked that for a reason, because Philomena mentioned biobank. That came up earlier as well in terms of preparation of samples. Obviously, you've got your biodiverse libraries. Is there a role for natural history museums in these countries? Who should step up to that? And you know.
So, I was going to go back to what Luke said. So, in Zanzibar, for a good example of a biorepository we have there, with thousands of urine samples stored over 5 years. And that funding for that study is coming to an end. That was a Gates-funded grant. Luckily, they have put an extension on that, so those samples will be safe. But in terms of safe, there are freezers again that are, that do fail and things like that. And we don't know what to do with those really, and how to get them into a central system where they're available. And yeah, so you mentioned the Natural History Museum, where we do collect things and we do store them. There's it's getting all those permits in place and all those administration issues in place. Just transporting samples, all of those kind of logistical things is very difficult to overcome. There's a lot of things about Nagoya protocols now about who owns those samples and what you can do with those samples, and permissions and ethics associated with them. And some of these samples haven't got that paperwork attached to them, so it's like, what do you do with those samples? I'm sure some of the polio samples won't have that paper attached to them as well. But at the museum, we are going through some of these processes of setting up that kind of paperwork and trying to get it in place, so in the future when we are collecting, that we are making sure that they have all the paperwork associated with them necessary, but they're stored properly, and that it's also openly available as well. Yeah. But it's a huge ask, and you need to invest and have the people and time. So
that's a great answer. I'd like to push that back to Philomena. You mentioned integrating lessons from West Africa, and there was an issue in terms of weak data management. One of the issues that you highlighted from the lab capacity, moving forward from lab capacity, is weak data management. How would you look to enhance that? Who should fill that role? Is it an open source conundrum that can be solved by people out there? Should be more formalised? Who needs to step up to that? to integrate the data that's already available, that's out there?
Well, I think for me in these countries, really the issue is that the health system is so weak to begin with. The systems in the country are so weak to begin with. So really it's about building capacities of the countries to be able to manage this data themselves, to be able to perform the testing themselves, to be able to run their own labs, to have their own quality management system. But obviously that takes, that's a long-term commitment, and it's all very well and good. We go in, we respond to the outbreak, and then we leave, but nothing is sustained after we leave. So, in Liberia, we were working with different partners on building a laboratory information system so that the lab results could connect with the epidemiological information, and so that all of this information was stored electronically. But that these are 2-year grants, they're 2-year commitments. So what happens when the grant finishes? What happens when the donor pulls out or the partners pull out? Then nothing is sustained. So really the only way we can build sustainable systems is to do it from a systems level, and not look at just one siloed approach of let's build a TB system or let's build a HIV system. We need to capitalize on all of these different systems that are already there to build a health system that actually works and that serves the people who need it.
Thank you for that. And to Richard, in terms of, you mentioned the input NGOs have, such as yourselves, into the design element, sensitivity, specificity, affordability to private sector. How about knowledge transfer, building on this healthcare system strengthening? Is there a role for a new NGO or an evolution of your own work? I'm asking that because of your vector-borne toolkit that you do put out. Is there an evolution that needs to happen in terms of your engagement? Is there a hole that you can fill in terms of knowledge strengthening in this kind of setting?
Yeah, I'm sort of reminded today of the two very different worlds we live in diagnostics. We have diagnostics for surveillance and surveillance for polio and Ebola. I worked in Lassa. I used to run the big Lassa responses in West Africa during the 90s and the epidemics. We had no resources. Today the resources in polio and Ebola have been astronomical, mind-blowing amounts of money. And so we've made real advances. But they don't take a point of care role in terms of informing treatment for somebody in front of you. And then you enter that world, and that's the world that is the one that actually saves the life of the person in front of you. So they're two totally different types of diagnosis for two totally different purposes. And we have very little input at all for the first, the surveillance role, in that sense. It's so well resourced, and you've got brilliant expertise. For the field settings, actually I think you have to have access to field platforms, you have to have access to real clinical samples, and you have to be able to inform the tool manufacturers of the conditions under which the tool has to perform. And we've seen tremendous success from that work of NGOs informing from the field platforms for malaria. We're beginning to see some of that being picked up for some of the other diseases. The biggest challenge for all of us, and I've said it before, is dengue fever. It's the fastest growing disease on earth. It's the only true pandemic we face. And it's rapidly engaging with Europe in a way that polio has left space for and everything else has left space for. But of course it's rampant across Africa, it's rampant across Asia. And we still don't have a point of care diagnosis that's useful. Yeah. And for us, point of care diagnosis is really important to understand. When you look at all the lab stuff you can do, that means a finger prick of blood. No lab, no preparation, a finger prick of blood or a urine sample, straight onto a test, a lateral flow device. And it's a huge challenge, we know it is, technology. But I would say we're working with a company in Cambridge at the moment, doing exactly this, informing them, and they're getting PCR level amplification on a lateral flow device from a raw sample. So it is possible, the technology is there, but it's also going to take time and investment.
I was wondering if the EDL from this one, the Essential Diagnostics List revision of that's going to come out in March, how much of that is going to enhance this input pathway that you've got into private sector?
It is enhancing it already, and organisations like FIND are helping to put a reality check in place and and working with some of the private commercial companies to help drive that really practical focus on disease diagnosis development. So there are positive moves forward. It does come down, though, I feel, very heavily on the actual point of care treatment to private companies' investment levels, rather than this extraordinary global level of investment we have from governments into the surveillance side of diagnostics.
Yeah.
So it's kind of the weak brother.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. Maria, from your perspective, you mentioned the difficulties in getting the samples from field isolates from people. Is this a training issue? Is it a hardware issue? What's the actual challenge within that for you from a Colombian perspective? Who needs to step into that to make that happen?
No, I think that it's not a training issue. It's not a training issue. We need some input from companies to be interested in develop the diagnosis technique and scale. Because in small labs, as the labs that have been done this effort, we develop just a research protocol, but we are it is not our vision to develop as a diagnosis method.
Yeah.
See you, Amy?
Yeah, so using the resources you've already got,
We are going no point.
Yeah. Are you communicating that? Is it communication
An
challenge?
enterprise doing the develop of the diagnosis method.
Is that a communication challenge to the private sector? Lucas mentioned at the end of his presentation
I think so.
Paper that was picked up. Should that be communicated more robustly at a country level to attract private sector towards this?
I think it's a communication issue.
Okay, good. From a funding perspective, a lot of people said there's a tail off of philanthropic investment. There's much more of a view towards private sector looking to step in. And so I want to push this out there. What kind of incentives are there? I'd like to ask Professor Mo in terms of companion diagnostics and linking this to vaccination programs perhaps, or treatment programs. Is there an incentive there that we can incentivize the sector with? Or are you working on something on that basis? Sorry. Yeah. Thank you, Benjamin.
Well, I wish I had an answer. I mean, I think the challenge that we had with, just in the commercial setting, of trying to put companion diagnostics was acceptance. There was a comment made earlier of parallel development. And so when you added parallel development of diagnostics with treatments, you have the same challenge. In other words, getting both of them funded and having them both arrive, getting the uptake of both of them. And so the challenge here of having point of care diagnostics companioned with treatment. So in some cases we have adequate treatments. Now we need the diagnostic to pair with it. In other cases we have inadequate treatments. So what we'd like to have is the diagnostic to flow along with it. So if I take my own incentive, if I think of the priority review voucher, it currently only incentivizes treatments alone. So an interesting, and we've had this thought before, should we amend it, should we propose to the Congress that it also incentivize treatments? It could, but you heard in my comments yesterday the problem of too many vouchers because of the inverse proportionality of the value of the voucher. So I think that another piece of this problem is, do we need to analyze the diseases, the burdens, look where we have adequate treatments, and then say we need new incentives for point of care diagnostics? And in other cases, when we have a new treatment need, an unmet need, do we need to think at the same time about how do we propose and encourage a companion diagnostic to flow through with it? But that's all a bunch of speculation. I don't know. Others may have ideas about how we better do that.
Thank you, Dr. Jeffrey. I wanted to ask, we've got malaria private sector here, we've got schisto private sector, dengue. Any input from the private sector? Without wanting to steal the thunder of anyone's presentation from this afternoon, but interesting to know.
To get the money.
Get the money.
It's a difficult sale at best. We go through lots of feasibility analysis. We try and drive the cost of the materials down as much as possible. Before releasing the product, we go into the right environmental conditions and take long-term trials. It's a very big challenge. The thing that works, that has worked for getting business to go into this, is selling them on the long-term results. When I go into a country in Africa or South America, like it or not, I open up a new market. And it may be with just one product or a panel of tests, but it gives you a beachhead established, and you can expand from there. And so that's the type of picture that I put in front of listeners. And I explain how it's never just one disease, because everybody has co-infections, and so one thing builds upon another. And when you look at the total, then it becomes worthwhile. The second thing I do is I tell them that every time you go into a new market like this, there's some side effects. You build infrastructure. We were alluding earlier about training people on the ground and establishing experts in the labs or in the clinics on the ground in Sierra Leone. It's the same thing with diagnostics. You train them how to use it, and it builds and it gets their comfort level up. And before you know it, you're having more sophisticated conversations about how to do better QC, how to get better results. You talk about things like storage and delivery and capacity, and all of a sudden, by accident, you're building things.
Thank you for that, Jim. Would there be any more questions? Or should we break for lunch? Oh, there's one from Ian in Bolton, Dropmid Farmer. Top.
Not a question, it's a comment.
It's a comment. Okay, great.
Just following on your point about the funding issue and how do we get private companies and make the right investment decisions. One of the things that is very noticeable, and this goes back to the discussion yesterday about communication and news and so on, is what is the message that is being heard by the managements of these companies that are going to make the investment decision? And if the drive to get the price or the cost of the test down to the levels Richard was talking about happens in a way and is communicated in a way that management looks at this and says, okay, we put all of this money into developing this test that we really need, and we're going to have to sell it virtually at cost, and who's going to pay for all our investment, and what's the point? And then on top of that, the regulatory environment through WHO or so on then makes it extremely difficult to put, version 3.0 on the market. Then the message is, well, what's the point? So I think there's a huge unintended consequence of the communication, and there's often a time lag as well. So they may be thinking in their minds, we heard this message. It was a message that was going out 2 or 3 years ago. That message may have changed, but it's not being heard by the people who are making the investment decisions. So there is a complicated communications issue that has to be addressed with this.
It's an interesting point. Thank you for that. I think that's one of the challenges moving forward. Would there be any other questions for the panel on the floor? If not, then should we break for lunch and then we can return at 2 o'clock. Thank you to the panelists.